The world can change in a single moment. Sometimes it takes just one quiet act of dignity to expose the truth hidden beneath polished smiles and company slogans. It all began with a father, a daughter, and a simple trip home. The boarding gate hummed with the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases and half-heard conversations. Mark Davis adjusted his black hoodie and glanced down at his daughter Emma, who was clutching a small brown teddy bear with a pink ribbon. Her bright eyes scanned the crowd, full of excitement. They were flying home after a week visiting her grandparents. "Dad," Emma asked, tugging his sleeve, "can we get hot chocolate before we go?" Mark smiled. "After check-in, sweetheart. We don't want to miss the flight." He approached the premium check-in counter, where a young airline agent's polite smile faltered slightly when she saw him. Her eyes darted from his casual clothes to the reservation screen. "First class," she said, raising her brows. "Both of you?" "Yes," Mark replied evenly. "Round trip?" "Same as last week." She hesitated, typing faster than necessary. "I'll need to verify the payment method used for this booking." Mark glanced at the family beside them, white, dressed casually, who were checked in within seconds. "No extra questions. No card verification." He said nothing. He simply slid his platinum card across the counter. The agent's smile returned, brittle and forced. "Everything looks fine. You're all set, Mr. Davis. Enjoy your flight." At the gate, the lead flight attendant, a woman named Karen, watched as passengers lined up. She whispered to the crew beside her, her tone low but cutting. "Keep an eye on that one," she said, tilting her chin toward Mark. "Probably used points." Mark heard every word. He said nothing. He just took Emma's hand and stepped into the first-class line. Karen greeted each passenger with rehearsed warmth, smiles, hand gestures, polite laughter. But when Mark presented his passes, her face cooled. She flipped them over, checked the back, and scanned them twice before stepping aside. "Down the jet bridge, first left," she said curtly. Inside the aircraft, the difference was immediate. White passengers were greeted by name. "Mr. Thompson, welcome aboard. Can I get you a glass of champagne?" When Mark asked for directions to seats 2A and 2B, another attendant, Brian, merely pointed without looking up. Emma climbed into her seat, her small legs dangling. She gasped when she discovered the entertainment screen and noise-canceling headphones. "Dad, they have games!" Mark smiled faintly, but his eyes flicked to the galley where Karen stood watching him. Whispering, he adjusted his seatbelt, feeling the weight of every sideways glance. The first-class cabin filled. Glasses clinked. Conversations murmured. When the attendants began serving pre-flight drinks, Mark noticed their row was skipped entirely. "Excuse me?" he said politely, raising his hand. "We haven't been offered any beverages yet." Brian turned, visibly irritated. "May I see your boarding passes again?" Mark handed them over. Brian checked them, left silently, and returned with 2 orange juices instead of the champagne everyone else received. "Enjoy your complimentary beverages," Brian said, stressing the word complimentary as if to remind them they didn't belong. Emma frowned. "Dad, why didn't they bring us the same drinks?" Mark smiled softly. "It's okay, sweetheart. Juice is better for us anyway." But inside he felt a familiar burn, a tight knot of anger he'd had to master over a lifetime. 20 minutes later, Karen approached. Her tone was polite, but her smile was weaponized. "Sir, I need to verify that you and your daughter are in the correct seats." Mark's patience thinned, but his voice stayed calm. "Of course. You're welcome to check, though this will be the 3rd time." She examined the tickets with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them to the light. "These seats are very expensive," she said loudly, ensuring nearby passengers could hear. A man across the aisle smirked behind his newspaper. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Why is she being mean to us, Dad?" she whispered. Mark took her hand. "Some people make mistakes about others, honey. That's all." Karen handed the tickets back with a stiff nod. "We'll need to confirm with the manifest." "Sit tight." She turned sharply and walked away. Mark exhaled slowly. He'd experienced bias before, in stores, at meetings, even restaurants, but something about this felt deeper, more deliberate. 15 minutes later, Karen returned with Brian beside her. "Sir," Brian began, "we'll need to see your ID as well. It's standard procedure." Mark looked around. None of the other first-class passengers were being questioned. He spoke evenly. "Is this standard for everyone or just certain passengers?" Brian hesitated, thrown off. "When needed," he muttered. Mark handed over his ID. Brian studied it far longer than necessary, then nodded stiffly. Everything seems to be in order. No apology. No acknowledgement. Emma sank into her seat. Did we do something wrong? She asked quietly. No, sweetheart, Mark said. We did everything right. But when Karen whispered again near the galley something about people who don't usually fly first class, Mark made a decision. He reached for his phone and began recording. Karen's head snapped around. Sir, recording is against airline policy. Actually, Mark replied calmly, your policy prohibits recording of safety procedures, not of harassment. The air grew heavy. Every nearby passenger pretended not to listen but couldn't look away. Brian stepped closer, voice low and tight. If you don't comply with crew instructions, we'll have to take further action. Emma's voice trembled. Dad, are they going to make us leave? Mark felt something inside him shift, an ancient mix of exhaustion and resolve. No, baby, he said softly. They won't. He turned off the camera but kept his eyes locked on the crew. We can talk, he said, but my daughter comes with me. As they walked toward the galley, whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers leaned away, others stared openly. Karen led the way. Brian followed behind, boxing them in. Inside the galley, away from most passengers, the tone changed. The politeness vanished. Brian crossed his arms. We just want to understand how you paid for these tickets, he said bluntly. Mark raised an eyebrow. Why would that matter? Karen shrugged. We've had issues with people using fraudulent upgrades. He looked between them. You're accusing me of fraud because I'm black and in first class. Sir, that's not what we said, Karen replied quickly. It's exactly what you implied. Her jaw tightened. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in economy. More people like... Brian cut her off, realizing too late what she was about to say. Mark's calm cracked into cold steel. Finish that sentence. Silence. He nodded slowly. Thank you. That's all I needed to hear. He guided Emma back to their seats, sat down, and typed a short message on his phone. Experiencing discrimination on Flight 481. Activate Protocol 3. Then he made a call. His tone stayed even. Good afternoon, Claire. Yes, it's me. I need legal and PR notified immediately. Situation in progress. The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something had shifted, something far beyond their control. Mark's voice stayed calm on the phone, but every word carried weight. Yes, Claire. Make the call to operations. I'm documenting everything. I expect an immediate response. He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the tray. Emma watched him with wide eyes, her small hands gripping the teddy bear tight. Dad, what's going to happen? He smiled faintly. Something important, sweetheart. Something that's long overdue. The hum of the aircraft grew louder as passengers settled in. But the energy in the cabin had changed. Conversations were no longer light and casual. People could feel something building like static before a storm. Karen stood near the front, whispering to another attendant, stealing nervous glances toward Mark. The pilot's door opened briefly, and a uniformed officer peeked out, eyebrows raised. Whatever was happening in first class had clearly reached the cockpit. Minutes later, Brian returned, voice stiff but subdued. Sir, we're experiencing a brief delay. Please remain seated. Mark didn't respond. He looked out the window instead, watching ground crew move with strange urgency. He could tell they weren't preparing for takeoff. They were waiting for someone. 20 minutes passed. Then the door to the aircraft opened with a hiss. The sudden rush of air silenced the cabin. Every head turned. 3 people in tailored suits stepped aboard. Their badges flashed under the cabin lights. Airline management. Karen's face went pale. The lead woman approached, her voice controlled but tight. Mr. Davis. Yes. I'm Victoria Hall, Regional Director of Passenger Services. May we have a word? You can speak here, Mark said. My daughter deserves to hear the same respect in public that we were denied in public. Victoria hesitated, scanning the curious faces of the other passengers. Her smile was thin, diplomatic. We understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Mark tilted his head slightly. A misunderstanding? Karen's hands fidgeted behind her back. You've questioned our tickets, our IDs, our payment, Mark said evenly. You skipped us for service. You suggested I might be more comfortable in economy. You called this a misunderstanding? The silence in the cabin grew dense. A woman 2 rows back spoke up, her voice sharp. I saw what happened. He's right. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Another man added, "This is discrimination, plain and simple." Victoria's expression faltered. "Please, everyone, I assure you." Mark cut her off gently but firmly. Assurance means nothing without accountability. He reached for his tablet, opened a file, and turned it toward her. "These are your airline's anti-discrimination policies. Sections 217 through 223. You've broken at least 4 of them." She blinked, thrown off. "Mr. Davis, you seem very familiar with our policies." "I should be," he said. "My company helped to draft them after a lawsuit 5 years ago." For a moment the truth hovered between them and comprehension rippled across her face. "You're with Orion Capital," she said slowly. "Founder," Mark corrected. "And as of last quarter, our firm owns 21% of your airline." The cabin filled with a stunned silence. Karen took an involuntary step backward. Brian looked as though the ground had vanished beneath him. Victoria swallowed hard. "Mr. Davis, He raised a hand gently. "Save it. What matters now is what you do next." Behind her, one of the executives whispered something into a phone, his voice shaking. Within minutes, another message came from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we're experiencing a technical delay. Please remain seated." But no one believed it. Outside, more airline staff gathered at the gate, their movements quick and anxious. Inside, Mark stayed silent, his fingers resting lightly on his daughter's hand. He wasn't angry anymore. He was focused. 20 minutes later, Victoria returned. "Mr. Davis," she said softly, "our CEO would like to meet with you personally before this flight departs." Mark's tone remained steady. "Then we'll meet. But this plane isn't leaving until the truth is addressed." She nodded quickly. "Of course." As she walked away, Emma looked up at her father. "Are they in trouble?" He smiled gently. "They're about to learn what accountability means." The minutes dragged on. The cabin was warm and restless, the murmurs growing louder. Then, without warning, the captain's voice came again, more serious this time. "Attention passengers, this flight will not be departing. Please remain seated as we coordinate rebooking and assistance." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Karen's lips parted in disbelief. "They're canceling the flight?" She whispered to Brian. Mark didn't need confirmation. He already knew. He leaned down toward Emma. "You see, honey, sometimes silence lets wrong things grow. But when you speak the truth, things stop moving until they're fixed." She nodded slowly, processing his words. Security officers entered the cabin. Not police, corporate security. They escorted Karen and Brian out quietly while the other passengers watched. No one said a word. Emma squeezed her father's hand. "Dad, are we going to get home?" "Eventually," he said softly. "But first, they have to face what they've done." They were escorted off the aircraft and into the VIP terminal, the air still thick with shock. Uniformed employees lined the corridor, whispering to each other. Some looked away in embarrassment. Others watched Mark with a mixture of fear and admiration. At the end of the hall, a tall man in a dark blue suit waited. His silver hair was combed neatly, his expression composed but tense. "Mr. Davis," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Richard Collins, CEO of Skyreach Airlines. I owe you and your daughter a personal apology." Mark shook his hand but said nothing, waiting. "I've been briefed," Richard continued quickly. "This does not reflect who we are as a company." Mark's calm voice cut through the air. "It reflects exactly who you are. The difference is now you know I can prove it." Richard's practiced corporate smile faltered. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately?" "My daughter was humiliated publicly," Mark said evenly. "We'll resolve it publicly." Behind Richard, 2 executives exchanged nervous looks. They knew the gravity of what was coming. Mark placed his tablet on the table. "Here's what happens next. A full internal review, independent oversight, and this flight, canceled, rebooked, and publicly acknowledged for what it was." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's unprecedented." "So was what happened to us." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of every word filled the room. Richard looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Understood." Outside, the announcement echoed through the terminal. "Attention passengers of Flight 481. This flight has been canceled due to operational concerns. Please proceed to the gate for rebooking." But everyone knew this wasn't about operations. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, are they going to change?" Mark crouched down so he was eye level with her. "They will," he said quietly. Because we're not letting them hide anymore. That was the day Skyreach Airlines shut down an entire flight, not because of weather or mechanics, but because one man refused to accept quiet humiliation. And that was only the beginning. The storm was about to reach the boardroom. The meeting room was sleek, quiet, and cold enough to sting. Mark could feel the chill even through his hoodie, but it wasn't the air conditioning that made the space tense. It was the weight of silence, the kind that falls when people know they've crossed a line they can't walk back from. Richard, the CEO, gestured toward the long glass table. "Please have a seat, Mr. Davis." Mark sat, resting his phone on the polished surface. Emma sat beside him, swinging her legs lightly, still clutching her teddy bear. The executives across the table avoided eye contact. Richard cleared his throat. "We've decided to remove the flight crew pending investigation. The company will conduct an internal review immediately." "That's a start," Mark replied, voice even. "But it's not enough." Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" Mark leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but unshakable. "Your employees didn't act in isolation. They reflected a culture that taught them who belongs where. You'll need more than suspensions. You'll need reform." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria, the regional director, tried to intervene. "We'll handle this discreetly." "No," Mark interrupted gently. "Discretion is the problem. You've buried stories like this before. That ends today." Richard's corporate mask cracked. "Mr. Davis, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" Mark smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed cold. "Upset is when your luggage is lost. This is about systemic humiliation." He tapped the table. "I've seen the numbers. 72 complaints of racial profiling in your first-class cabins in the past 3 years, 18 involving children. And your response has been internal memos and quiet settlements. You've treated symptoms, not disease." Richard's voice dropped. "How do you know about those numbers?" Mark tilted his head. "Because I'm one of your board members as of next week. Orion Capital's 21% stake didn't come from nowhere. I invested to help fix this company. Now I see why it needs fixing." The words hit like thunder. One executive gasped softly. Victoria's pen slipped from her hand. Richard's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment. "You're the new board appointee? The one who wanted a service audit?" "That's right," Mark said. "And congratulations, you just failed the audit." Emma watched quietly, sensing the gravity of her father's tone even if she didn't understand the corporate jargon. Richard took a slow breath. "What do you want from us?" Mark's reply came steady, deliberate. Transparency, public acknowledgement, a formal statement taking responsibility for what happened. Not spin, not excuses. Truth. "That's highly damaging," Richard protested. "Our shareholders are me," Mark said softly. 21% of them, to be exact. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of air vents. "I want an independent investigation," Mark continued. "Outside auditors. Mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff. A new complaint system where passengers can report discrimination without fear of being ignored. And one more thing." Richard looked wary. "What's that?" "You cancel the flight publicly, for the real reason. You tell every passenger the truth, that you're addressing discrimination. No euphemisms, no corporate fog." "That could destroy our brand," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark looked at her. "No, Ms. Hall. It'll save it." He glanced at Emma, who was watching the adults in silence, her expression serious beyond her years. "My daughter deserves to grow up in a world where respect doesn't depend on who's holding the ticket." Richard rubbed his temples, defeated. "Fine, we'll issue a statement." Mark nodded once. "Good. I'll review it before it's released." Moments later, an assistant rushed into the room holding a tablet, pale-faced. "Sir, videos from the flight are already circulating online." "What kind of videos?" Richard asked sharply. "Passengers recorded the confrontation. It's spreading fast." "How fast?" "Trending across multiple platforms. The hashtag #FirstClassWhileBlack is climbing." The room froze. Mark didn't smile, but his voice softened. "You can still control the narrative. Be honest. or the world will control it for you. Richard stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. We'll tell the truth. Within an hour, the airline's public relations team crafted a statement. Mark reviewed every line before it went live. The message admitted to an incident involving discriminatory treatment of passengers and promised a full investigation and policy overhaul. By nightfall, news outlets were replaying the footage from inside the cabin. Millions of views, thousands of comments, some expressed outrage. Others shared their own stories of humiliation and profiling. Emma watched her father's phone light up with notifications. "Dad, everyone's talking about it," she said softly. "They should," he replied. "Silence is what allows things like this to keep happening." For the next few days, the world buzzed. Skyreach Airlines trended for the wrong reasons. Shareholders demanded explanations. Advocacy groups praised Mark's composure. Passengers from other airlines began sharing similar experiences. But while the internet roared, Mark worked quietly behind the scenes. He joined emergency board meetings, reviewed reports, and set new expectations. "This isn't about firing people to look good," he told the executives. "It's about building a system that doesn't allow bias to hide." Inside corporate headquarters, denial gave way to discomfort. Then discomfort turned into action. An independent law firm was hired to audit discrimination complaints. A diversity and ethics task force was formed with real authority. Flight attendant unions were brought into discussions for the first time. Mark insisted on one principle above all: transparency. Every report, every statistic, every uncomfortable truth would be shared publicly. Within weeks, patterns emerged. Training manuals that used coded language about maintaining first-class standards, performance bonuses tied to passenger perception, and internal emails suggesting extra vigilance for certain demographics. The evidence painted a picture more damning than anyone had expected. In one board meeting, Mark stood at the head of the table, calm but unflinching. "This company doesn't have a few bad employees," he said. "It has a system built to protect comfort at the expense of fairness." One older board member crossed his arms. "We can't admit that. The liability already exists," Mark interrupted. "The difference now is whether we hide from it or fix it." Richard, visibly drained, nodded. "We fix it." For the first time since the incident, Mark allowed himself to exhale, but he wasn't finished. The problem wasn't only Skyreach, it was the entire industry, trained to see worth through wardrobe, status through skin, belonging through bias. He knew if change was going to mean something, it had to go beyond one airline, and that's where he planned to take it next. The story spread faster than anyone in Skyreach's executive tower could have imagined. Screens glowed through the night with clips of Karen's sharp voice, Brian's dismissive tone, Emma's small, frightened question. It was no longer one man's humiliation. It was a mirror held up to an industry. When the emergency board meeting convened, every seat was filled, and yet silence dominated the room. Mark sat at the head of the table this time, no longer the quiet passenger in a hoodie. He wore a charcoal suit, simple but exact, a look that conveyed both composure and intent. Richard entered late, carrying a tablet and nerves. "The numbers aren't good," he admitted. 17 million views across platforms. "We've lost 8% of our market value in 2 days. Mark glanced up from the stack of papers in front of him. "And how many people have read the statement about accountability?" "Roughly the same," Richard said. "But they don't believe us yet." "Then we give them a reason to." He projected a graph onto the screen, lines of data, peaks of outrage, and valleys of silence. "This," he said, "is what happens when discrimination meets denial. It never stays quiet. It waits, it festers, and then it erupts." An older board member, a man named Harold, leaned back with folded arms. "With all due respect, Mr. Davis, are you suggesting we turn our company into a social experiment?" Mark looked at him steadily. "I'm suggesting you turn it into what it claims to be, a company that treats passengers with dignity." Another member murmured agreement under his breath. The tide in the room had begun to shift. Mark walked them through his proposal: an independent ethics committee that reported directly to the board, a public database tracking every verified discrimination complaint, and a complete rewrite of training manuals that stripped away coded language about passenger fit. Harold scoffed. "You want us to broadcast our flaws?" "Yes," Mark said simply, "because hiding them made them grow." The chief legal officer spoke next, cautious but respectful. "He's right. Courts punish concealment more than the act itself. Full transparency limits long-term liability." By the end of the 3-hour meeting, a rare thing happened: unanimous approval. Skyreach would rebuild its system from the ground up. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Investigators interviewed crew members, supervisors, and managers. What they found was worse than anyone had guessed. Unwritten rules passed quietly between generations of staff. Guidelines to protect the atmosphere of premium service. It wasn't official policy, but it was culture. And culture was harder to rewrite than any handbook. Mark insisted on hearing from the crew directly. When he entered the review session, Karen and Brian were there, sitting side by side with their lawyers. They looked smaller now, not because of humiliation, but because the walls of unspoken approval that once shielded them were gone. Karen spoke first. "I've worked here for 19 years. I was following procedure." Mark's tone was calm. "Can you show me where that procedure is written?" She hesitated. "It isn't written, but it's how we've always done things. We're told to keep first class orderly, to make sure the right passengers are where they should be." "Who told you that?" She looked down. "Everyone. It's just understood." Brian's voice cracked the quiet. "She's not lying. We were graded on maintaining standards." That's the word they used, standards. The HR director slid a report across the table. "In the last year, 23 of your verification incidents involved passengers of color. Only 2 involved white passengers." Karen's face went pale. "I didn't mean," Mark interrupted softly. "Intent doesn't erase impact." He paused, letting the weight of that truth hang. "You were part of a system that rewarded suspicion over service. That system ends today." Brian lowered his eyes. "I understand." For the first time, Mark heard remorse that sounded real. Karen folded her arms, defensive. "So what happens to us?" Mark looked at her, not unkindly. "What happens next depends on whether you learn from what you did. But the real change won't come from punishment. It'll come from every employee who decides to do better." Outside that conference room, reporters gathered like weather. The company released findings to the public, a move that stunned analysts and softened critics. For the first time, Skyreach didn't hide behind jargon. The statement read simply, "We failed, and we are rebuilding." Over the next months, reform took shape in small, quiet victories. Every flight attendant underwent new training built around empathy, not enforcement. A reporting system went live that allowed passengers and employees to flag discrimination directly to the ethics committee, and something began to shift. Flight attendants stopped watching for who belonged. They started watching for who needed help. Service improved across every class. Crew satisfaction rose. Passenger complaints dropped sharply. By the 6th month, the numbers told their own story. Customer trust was returning. Revenue rebounded. Skyreach became an unexpected example of what honesty could do for a brand once poisoned by silence. But for Mark, success wasn't in numbers. It was in the stories that began to surface. A black mother emailed him about being greeted warmly by name during her first-class flight. A teenager with mixed heritage wrote that it was the first time she'd boarded a plane without being stared at. A white flight attendant sent a note thanking him for removing the fear of making mistakes that training had once drilled into them. Mark read every message, one by one. And one morning, when Emma came downstairs for breakfast, she found him smiling for the first time in weeks. "Dad," she asked, "are things really better now?" He thought for a long moment. "Better isn't perfect," he said, "but it's a start. And sometimes that's how change begins. Slowly, but surely." That night, he received an invitation to speak at an international aviation conference. The topic was reform and accountability in corporate culture. He hesitated at first. He didn't like the spotlight. But when he looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in her room, he knew he couldn't decline. The world needed to hear what had happened. Not for his pride, but for every passenger who had ever felt smaller just for existing. And as the conference date drew near, Mark realized that what started as one flight gone wrong was turning into something larger. a movement that demanded the skies themselves become fair. He wasn't done yet. The last chapter of his journey was about to take off. The conference hall was a vast space filled with quiet expectancy. Rows of executives, journalists, and regulators sat beneath banners that read, Global Aviation Summit, Building Trust in the Skies. Cameras were already trained on the stage where Mark was scheduled to speak. He stood behind the curtain, straightening his tie, breathing slowly. In a single year, he had gone from being a silent passenger to the man every airline executive wanted to understand, or secretly, to avoid. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a father who refused to let silence raise his child. A staffer signaled him. He stepped onto the stage. Applause began softly and grew as the crowd rose. Mark waited for the sound to settle before he began. 1 year ago, he said, I boarded a flight with my daughter expecting an ordinary trip home. What happened on that flight changed everything, not because of who I am, but because of what it revealed. The hall grew still. He told the story without bitterness, describing the slow erosion of dignity that begins with a glance, a whisper, a demand to prove you belong. He described Emma's tears and the silence of the other passengers. Then, in simple words, he explained how accountability could rebuild what discrimination destroys. When I demanded answers, I wasn't just asking for justice for myself, he said. I was asking whether the world my daughter inherits will be one where worth is measured by humanity or by prejudice. We chose humanity, and the results spoke for themselves. He clicked to the next slide. Graphs appeared showing improved service ratings, higher staff satisfaction, and reduced incidents across every region. This isn't just about moral duty, Mark continued. It's good business. When people are treated with respect, they respond with loyalty. Dignity is profitable. A ripple of murmurs passed through the hall. CEOs leaned forward. Analysts scribbled notes. Mark concluded with quiet conviction. Change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts when someone refuses to look away. When one voice says, "This isn't right," others begin to listen. He stepped back as the audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. But as he left the stage, all he could think about was Emma waiting at home. That evening, he returned to their house on the edge of the city. The sun was low, painting the sky with soft gold. Emma was at the kitchen table, working on a project surrounded by colored papers and markers. She looked up, her face bright. "Dad, I made something." He walked over and smiled. On the poster she'd drawn, bold letters read, "Fair starts everywhere." Below it were simple rules written in her careful handwriting. Listen first. Be kind. Treat everyone like they belong. "That's beautiful," Mark said softly. "It's for school," she explained. "We're learning how to make things fair for everyone. My teacher said my idea could be part of the class rules next year." Mark felt his throat tighten. "That's exactly what I've been trying to do too." She tilted her head. "So we're both changing the rules?" He laughed quietly. "Looks like it." Weeks later, Skyreach became the first airline to publish a full passenger bill of dignity, displayed in every terminal. It promised equal treatment for every traveler, no matter their race, class, or appearance. Other airlines followed, first reluctantly, then proudly once they saw passengers responding with trust instead of anger. The reform spread beyond aviation, into hotels, transport services, even corporate offices. People started using Mark's story as a model for confronting hidden bias in everyday systems. When Emma and Mark took their next flight together, the atmosphere was entirely different. At the check-in desk, the agent smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Davis, Miss Davis. Welcome back." No hesitation. No scrutiny. Just simple respect. On board, the purser stopped by their seats. "It's an honor to have you both flying with us," she said sincerely. Mark nodded, returning the smile. "The honor's ours. Thank you for proving that change can take flight." As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted into the fading sunset, Emma looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels lighter this time." "It is," Mark replied, "because the sky belongs to everyone now." The clouds stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon wide open, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt closer to fair. One flight, one voice, one truth had turned turbulence into transformation.